Hi everyone, welcome to this week's bi-weekly Hangout on Air series. Today we are talking about a deep dive on Firebase Analytics and Google Tag Manager for mobile apps v2. I'm Krista Seiden, Analytics Advocate at Google, and today I'm joined by Fontaine Foxworth, who is the PM on Firebase Analytics, and Scott Herman, who is the PM on GTM. So thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
All right, so before we dive in, let's go ahead and take a look, let's submit our questions. Just a quick reminder, as always, submit your questions either via the form link that's in the HOA chat box window of the event that you're logged into, or you can always just submit the questions via the chat box. Okay, let's take a look at our agenda. So first, we're going to start with an overview and a demo of Firebase Analytics. Then we're going to look at an overview and demo of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps v2. And then we'll finish up with our resources and take your questions. So do submit your questions throughout the whole thing. We're really eager to see what you guys are curious about and answer as many of your questions as you guys can get in there. But before we get into all of that, I want to take a moment to have everyone think about the experiences that we have with mobile apps on a daily basis. So users are unlocking their phones about 150 times a day on average. And lots of app developers already have a lot of different analytics tools and reporting tools in their apps, right? Mm-hmm. They have things like crash reporting and push notifications and conversion tracking and behavioral tracking. And there's so many different options that are in apps right now. Mm-hmm. So we set out to find a way to consolidate all of that, right? And a lot of tools out there let you see aggregate data. But we wanted to help you figure out a way to sift through those trends to find the real insights of how users are actually engaging with your app. And finally, data for data's sake isn't really that important, right? It's about getting to what that data is telling you and acting on the real insights there, right? So we wanted to be sure that app developers were also able to act on those insights so that they could use that data and that information to optimize the efforts that they're already making. So that is just some of the background and reasons why we have invested over the last year or so in Firebase and Firebase Analytics. And I'm going to hand it over to Fontaine now, who's going to tell us a lot more about it.
Thank you, Krista. All right, so this year at Google I/O, we launched Firebase, which is an integrated suite of a bunch of developer products available through Google. And there's a series of products that allows you to develop your app, grow your user base, and earn money. Now, we've got 14 different features available in Firebase Analytics. In Firebase, and each one of those features can be categorized in either this develop, grow, or earn bucket, depending on what actual functionality is available. But Firebase Analytics specifically isn't categorized under develop, grow, or earn, because it's really the data layer that's tying all of the features together. So you'll notice here in this visual, it's really at the core of Firebase, since this data is supercharging all of the features inside Firebase.
Yep.
Now, there's a couple of different things before we dive into the demo that I want to set the stage with around Firebase Analytics. First of all, it's free and unlimited, so you get access to all of your data without compromise. So this means no hit limits and no sampling. And when we set out to build Firebase Analytics a while ago, this was really one of our founding tenets. We really wanted to be able to give app developers access to all of the data that they need without limiting them.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's actually built by the same team that built Google Analytics for apps. So we were able to use a lot of the insights that we had discovered over the last few years and working with hundreds of thousands of apps to really build a product that was intended for app developers.
That's awesome.
And then the second thing I wanted to highlight was there's a lot of automatic event reporting. So immediately after plugging Firebase Analytics into the app, you get a bunch of reports just out of the box. And so you get a whole bunch of events that are reported automatically. I think we've got about 12 events that are reported automatically. So things like app update or OS update, first open, etc.
So is that similar to the out-of-the-box reports that come in Google Analytics, where you just install the tracking code and you immediately get things like pages and, time on site and bounce rate and users, those kind of things?
Exactly. So we have a whole bunch of reports that come immediately by just adding the 2 lines of code that comes with the SDK.
That's great. That makes it super simple for app developers to get started.
Yeah, and the reporting is specific to app developers. So we take a lot of the insights and patterns that we've gained from Google Analytics and applied it to app development.
Great.
And then finally, with Firebase Analytics, we very deliberately set out to make a product that's easily integrated across Firebase and then also across different Google products. So we can highlight in a little bit, but Firebase Analytics integrates really well with Firebase notifications. So if you wanted to send push notifications to your users, or if you wanted to serve different experiences, configure different experiences in your app, or even target your advertising to your specific audiences in Firebase. So a couple other things I want to highlight before getting into the demo.
Okay.
So we have support on both Android and iOS, since we know that app developers are developing on both platforms. And we will continue to be committed to building a platform agnostic tool. And now I'm going to go ahead and hop into the demo so you can see what it looks like in real life.
Awesome. I'm excited for this.
All right. So here what we're looking at is an app called Transworld Endless Skater. Transworld Endless Skater is a game that is available on both iOS and Android, and it has in-app purchases in it, so users, when they're playing the game, can purchase different items in the app, like virtual currency, and then they can spend that virtual currency to unlock different features or levels in the game. Now for this particular app, I have it on both iOS and Android. So if I click here, I can see my Android package and my iOS package. Right now, I'm going to just focus on the iOS package, but I can certainly click over into Android and see the performance there. Now this here, you can see on our left nav with Firebase, a lot of the different features that I highlighted a minute ago. Now we're just going to focus on analytics for now, but you can get a sense of all of the other different functionality that's available in Firebase. So we're going to start here with the dashboard, and right immediately, you can see a lot of app-specific metrics. So your active users, your monthly active users, available here, your daily active users. So you can start to get an idea of how frequently users are actually coming into your app.
That's a really important metric typically to app developers, right?
Yeah, especially for app developers, monthly active users, or often you hear MAU. This is one of the most important metrics that we hear from our app developers.
So that is front and center on that dashboard when you log in.
Yeah, and this is a great example of something that's available out of the box. So just simply by putting in the Firebase SDK, you get something like monthly active users immediately.
That's awesome.
Now we also have average revenue, which these metrics, ARPU and ARPAPU, stand for average revenue per user and average revenue per paying user. So we're pulling from the in-app purchase event if you're logging that, or if you have an e-commerce purchase, we're pulling that in. So you can really start to see your breakdown of different metrics, again, monthly, weekly, and daily, so you're not having to change the date range every time you want to get these different breakdowns. Another thing to highlight about this particular game, since it's using in-app purchases which are processed by Google Play and the App Store, we're actually able to report those automatically. So again, this developer didn't have to instrument extra code to capture these in-app purchases. We were able to capture those and report them automatically.
And that's seamless from both the Play Store and the Apple Store?
Yeah, absolutely. So on both iOS and Android, we're able to report that. Now, we come down here to first open attribution. This is an area we've been really excited about with Firebase Analytics. You talked a little bit earlier about how so many times app developers have a bunch of different analytics tools in their app. And you talked about conversion tracking and behavioral analytics and push notification analytics, et cetera. Now, something we've been really trying to do with Firebase is bring that all together. So you no longer have to have your data in these different places, these different silos, captured by totally different tools. Now, this particular widget here is talking about attribution. So it's really all about the conversion tracking angle. So you can see not just what your users are doing when they're in your app, but also where are they coming from, which ones of your campaigns are the most effective. So you can see for this particular app, they've been driving a bunch of traffic from different sources. And you can start to see how many first opens were brought to you by these different sources, but also what is the lifetime value of these different channels. So you're not just looking at the quantity of users that these channels are driving, but also the quality of users that these channels are driving. And the lifetime value here is also calculated using the same metrics that ARPU and ARPPU are pulling from.
So I just want to go back to one thing you just mentioned, which was that Firebase Analytics has all of these different metrics that normally people are looking at through multiple tools. That means that Firebase Analytics is really speaking the same language across all of these different metrics, which you aren't able to, say with certainty when you have so many different tools doing a lot of this, right?
Absolutely. So that was that integration and having like the single platform to do everything was very much something that we are setting out to tackle and something we really wanted to try to bring together. We know that when you're an app developer, adding new SDKs to your app every time you want to measure something different can often be a headache, and then also just makes your app heavier. So we wanted to reduce the amount of load in your app, just have a single SDK and a single platform that can track all the different types of analytics things that you would traditionally track.
And so this SDK is pretty lightweight and has everything in there that you're really going to need.
Yes. And we'll continue to invest in making the reporting more robust, but we're pretty excited about what we are able to offer in the first version of it.
Awesome. Sorry to interrupt. Let's keep going.
No, this is perfect.
So exciting.
We have here retention cohorts. So if anyone's familiar with Google Analytics, you can see the drop-off for different cohorts of users. So you can really start to understand the retention patterns of users in your app. We have cards for user engagement. So you can see how many sessions are per user in this time frame, or what's the daily engagement per user, like on average, how much time are users spending in my app a day. We have in-app purchases. Again, this is reported automatically. So this particular developer didn't have to do any additional work for this to be reported automatically. We've got app version, devices, location, and then we're also pulling in Google data around demographics so you can see the male-female breakdown or the age groups. And then down here, interests. So these are things that a lot of analytics providers can't provide, but since Google has such a strong footprint across so many apps and so many devices, we have a good understanding of demographic breakdown across them.
Awesome. Can you go back up just to right here to this app version one? So does this show the drop off then? So let's say that dark blue one, that's like an earlier version. So you're kind of looking at the drop off over time. That's really cool. I remember doing this type of analysis using like really old version of the GA SDK a long time ago, and it being very, very manual. And this is just completely out of the box.
Yeah. And especially with apps, versions are such a critical piece because often when you're launching a new feature, it's only available in the first version of the app. So it's really important when you're doing your analysis of that feature that you're just looking at the version that actually applies to. So having all of this available immediately is a pretty important part of the overall functionality of Firebase.
That's awesome. So this is just the dashboard when you log in.
Yeah, so everything that actually we just looked at in the dashboard is available out of the box, and you have to do no additional work beyond simply plugging in the SDK. So it's pretty intended for not only folks who are pretty sophisticated with their analytics, but for any users who are new to analytics and just trying to get warmed up, everything here in this dashboard would be filled in automatically.
Right. I mean, you can be sophisticated, but it also sounds like you don't need to be sophisticated at all. All you need to do is install 2 lines of code. You have all this right at your fingertips.
Exactly. And of course, if you want to instrument more events, more custom events, you certainly can. So I'll go ahead and tap over into events at this point. And events are basically the currency of Firebase Analytics. Firebase Analytics is run entirely off of events, which are very similar to events in Google Analytics, and user properties, which are similar to custom dimensions in Google Analytics, but at the device level. So these are basically, I like to consider them, the verbs are the events, and then the adjectives are the user properties.
I've never heard anybody relate grammar to analytics.
I can do it.
That's pretty amazing. So just from my own understanding, pretty sure apps are very much considered to be event-based in general, right? It doesn't make sense to track them at like a page view or virtual page view type of level, as we've typically done in the past with, the old SDK.
Right.
And that's why Firebase Analytics is completely event-based.
Right, exactly. And so we do have a bunch of events that are captured automatically, but beyond that, if you want to log your own custom events, you certainly can. And events in Firebase are a little bit different than events in GA. So you can send up to 500 events, different types of events to Firebase. And then in each one of those events, you can send up to 25 parameters. So those are basically key value pairs, whatever you want them to be, basically extra metadata about those events. So in GA, of course, you've got category, action, label. So it's very similar to parameters, but you have those 3 kind of canonical parameters. Here in Firebase Analytics, you have up to 25, but you can define what exactly those key value parameters are.
Oh, wow. That sounds very flexible.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So here you can see, I'll highlight some of the automatically available events, and then also some of the ones that we've captured in a custom manner. So first open here. First open is like an install. It's what people often refer to as an install in the industry, but it's basically when an app is open for the first time.
So I would equate that in analytics to having a campaign in market and somebody clicking through in that campaign and coming to my website, and that'll fire off like a pixel for a DoubleClick or AdWords or something like that, and it's considered a conversion. So that's kind of similar to whatever channel drove them. They installed the app and then they had that first open conversion.
Exactly. And that's also in the attribution section, which we'll probably highlight later. You can see the breakdown per campaign. Awesome. And then in GA, we have that new users report. So the first open report here is very similar to that new users report. So in all of these, I can click into them and see pretty rich reporting. I'll click into in-app purchase. And throughout the product, you can see count. So how many times that particular event fired. You can see in this time range, it was 142. I can see users. So how many users took this action in the time frame. And then what was the value of that particular event. So since the value of in-app purchase is monetary, we have that $sign here. And this particular event has driven 3,500 roughly of value in the past 30 days.
And is the solid line versus hashed line, is that comparing to the previous period?
Yes, exactly. So actually throughout Firebase Analytics, we have comparisons baked into every single report. This is really something, again, that we wanted to set out to do, is bring in contextual and comparative data, because we know a lot of time your analysis is relative to previous periods. So yeah, that dotted line in the background is the previous period, and then the darker line is the selected period. So in this particular event, in-app purchase, I can see the top products and how much each product is bringing in, the average purchase value, the conversion rate, etc. And then I can see other things like location and demographics down at the bottom. This is an example of an out-of-the-box event. Now let's look at an event that's more custom. I'm going to expand to see what else I have. All right, we will look at, let's look at select content. So select content, this is an event specific to games that we often recommend. And it has, similar to a bunch of the other reports, it has count, users, count per users, and value. This particular event doesn't have a value, hence why it's 0. But I can see this particular widget right here, this content widget, it has a different type of visualization that we didn't see on the other report. That's because we understand the syntax of select content. We've created this very specific widget for that. So when you're selecting content in the game, you can either select a skater or boosts. So you can see the breakdown between those two. And there's a little bit more basically breakdown of the reporting. If I were to click into skater, I can see which skater exactly they were selecting. So this is where you can see an application of those parameters that I was talking about. It's not just about the event select content, but there's a bunch of rich metadata available in the event using the parameters. So I can see both the type of content that was selected, skaters or boosts, and then the item ID. So when you're in skater, exactly which skater did they select.
Nice. You said this is one that you typically recommend. Does that mean that there's some kind of a list of additional events that we have in developer docs or something like that for people?
Great question. So actually, when we launched Firebase Analytics, we came out with a guide for different types of verticals and events that we're recommending that users fire. So of course, it's just a guide, and all developers are welcome to hook up their analytics in any way that they see fit. However, we do have for travel or e-commerce or games or whatever it is, a series of different events that we recommend in case you're new to analytics and you want something to really understand how to hook up your app using these events. And similar to select content, a lot of these events have dedicated reporting that comes with them. So not only does it help with a guide of how to register your app, but also it highlights specific parameters, specific metrics that since we understand the syntax of those events, basically how we should visualize them.
That's great.
Yeah. All right, so we looked a little bit at events. A couple other things I'll highlight while we've got this open.
Yeah, I definitely want to go through a few more of those tabs.
Yeah, so let's talk about audiences. So audiences is effectively the way to slice and dice, really drill into your data. And you highlighted this early on when you said we wanted to be able to get at different trends in the analytics and not just looking at total aggregate data. So we have these audiences that are here, and you can create a new audience using this. And when you're creating a new audience, I'll go ahead and just walk through a flow. You can select the events and parameters that you actually want to hone in on. So for example, if I wanted to say users who spent virtual currency, then I could select the event, spend virtual currency, create this, and then I'm really creating an audience of just users who've taken this specific action, and I can do analysis across the product. Now, I already have a couple of similar, I actually right here, purchase level 2. This is an example of a very similar audience that I created last week, which is basically users who had spent virtual currency to unlock level 2. Now, audiences can be used in a couple of different ways.
That's what I was going to ask.
The first is we just have reporting available right here. So for example, if I were to click on the males 25 to 34, then I have a dedicated report for this audience. I can see how many users over time have been in this audience, what's the ARPU of this group of users. I can even see the interests of this specific group of users. So for males in this particular age range, I can see they are interested in online video and online games. That makes a lot of sense, given this is a skating game that's available here. But it's pretty exciting that you can really start to hone in on different groups and understand their behavior.
And it's all of those really important metrics to app reporting in particular, like the version and the ARPU and things. It kind of reminds me of like the audience overview report in GA. And when you add a segment to that, it kind of shows all of that data with that filter. So that's basically what you're doing here, right? When you're clicking in and showing all of those really important reports to app reporting with the filter of that audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right that what we're doing here is very similar to applying the segment on the audience report in GA. The one thing to highlight is because we are, in fact, creating an aggregate when these audiences are created, there's no sampling when you're looking at this. This is the true counts of the data here. So I know that's definitely something that we've heard excitement from developers around.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you said there's a few ways you can use audiences.
Yeah.
How else can we use them?
Another way is you can apply it as a filter to any of your reports. So if I were on, actually I'll come into an event report. And I'll see, let's see, level end. So this is users who are doing level end. If I wanted to add as a filter, I can see all of my audiences here. So I can see users who finished 5 runs, users who finished 2 runs. I'll go ahead and apply that same audience we were just looking at. So I can see the metrics changed here, and now I can look specifically for this group of users, what is their behavior. Naturally, the demographics for this particular report updated to only be the criteria that we already selected. Again, this is all aggregated and the true counts of this information rather than sampled, which is pretty exciting.
So basically you are filtering or slicing and dicing down all of your different event reports by your audience.
Exactly.
Nice.
And then the final way that you can use audiences is to take action on and use the insights that you've unlocked in Firebase Analytics to actually make moves and make decisions in other products. So certainly you can do that in AdWords. So if you wanted to, for example, run a remarketing campaign targeted at your in-app purchasers, since you know that they're particularly valuable, that is totally available, and all of your audiences will be available in AdWords. You could also target a notification, for example. We have this notification section here where you can actually draft a push notification in Firebase and then target it to that specific group of users.
Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah.
And you can do that based off of their event actions or their demographic makeups or all of this different data that you know about them. You can send notifications just to those specific audiences.
Exactly. And not only can you target the audiences that you've created with Firebase Analytics, but will also help you close the loop with these different products. So you can see, for example, how many users who received that notification actually went on to open the notification, and then what did they do throughout the rest of the experience. So it's not just about targeting, but we're also giving you the reporting for those notifications as well.
That's awesome. So I know we have limited time here, but I really do want to hear a little bit about maybe either funnels or cohorts. Like, can you share one more thing with us here?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at funnels.
Awesome. That's one I was hoping you were going to pick.
So you can create a funnel by listing out different events in a particular visualization. So I'm going to start with a simple funnel here, purchasers. And for this particular funnel, we only have 2 steps. We wanted to see how many users did first open, which is basically how many users ever came to the app in this time period, and then how many actually went on to in-app purchase. And I can visualize this funnel both on a user's level and on an event count level. So for this particular one, you can see it has a pretty low conversion rate of 0.4%. If I look at it on an event count, it's slightly higher at 0.7%. So now, of course, we're looking at the count of times that this actually happened rather than the number of users. So you can add, you can also see the table down here of count, value, and users.
And how many steps can you add in your funnel?
You can add up to 10 steps in your funnel.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah. So a pretty important way that we've heard developers want to visualize their data.
Nice. That's awesome.
Great. So let's actually go back to the deck now. I want to highlight a couple more things before we hand it over to Scott to talk about Google Tag Manager.
Great.
So I'm sure a lot of people are interested in what's the relationship between Firebase Analytics and Google Analytics.
I know we've heard a lot of questions on that so far.
So we have a couple of different paths that we're recommending developers take depending on the needs of their business. And I want to highlight them really quickly here in this slide. So depending on the needs of your business, you can really hone in on the appropriate solution. The first is we just looked at Firebase in the UI of Firebase. There's a whole bunch of different Firebase features. And if it makes sense for you, particularly if you're just an app developer, you don't have a website, it makes sense to just live in the Firebase context. So that is the option here on the left, is using the 2 products separately depending on your business needs, but you could use the Firebase interface for Firebase Analytics and then the Analytics interface for the Google Analytics interface for your web tracking. Now, if it's important to see both sets of data in the same interface, since you know that people are already living and breathing in Google Analytics, and it's important that they're actually seeing their Firebase data there as well, you do have the ability to link your Firebase apps to your Google Analytics properties. So you can actually see your Firebase Analytics, which we just saw today, available in Google Analytics.
Awesome.
So you don't have to open separate tabs. They're all going to be available there. It will be listed as in the property picker of the different properties that you have access to.
Nice.
And then finally, and Scott's going to highlight this a little bit more in a minute, if it's important for you for your data to be captured and stored in the same way that Google Analytics data is stored, then that's also possible. We still recommend that you capture your data using Firebase Analytics, but using Google Tag Manager, we would recommend that you send the data over to Google Analytics using Firebase Analytics basically as the collection method, and then sending it over to Google Analytics using Google Tag Manager. There's a couple of different reasons that you would want to do this. For example, Google Analytics is covered, Google Analytics 360 has an SLA. Firebase Analytics does not have an SLA. There's a couple other reasons, depending on your business needs, why it might make sense if you're using roll-up properties or something like that. But I'm going to have Scott dive in a little bit more into actually how you can use Google Tag Manager in this context.
Awesome. Thanks. So with the launch of this largely expanded Firebase platform with Firebase Analytics, we've also launched a new version of Tag Manager for mobile apps. Similarly, this is available both across iOS and Android. And as Fontaine points out, this is uses the same implementation, the same instrumentation that you might do in your app for Firebase Analytics in order to act as that input or the data layer for Google Tag Manager, which is really exciting. So we've largely rebuilt Google Tag Manager for mobile apps to work alongside Firebase Analytics, and there's a lot of benefits to doing so. So let's take a look at a few of them. So first of all, as I mentioned, this is a unified in-app implementation. And what that really means is that any developer who's already gotten started with Firebase Analytics can use Google Tag Manager without adding any additional code, any additional events or parameters or properties to their apps. So this is a great way to ensure that there's consistency between your different measurement tools and also to make sure that you don't get lost. One of the things that we've heard over the years with Google Tag Manager for mobile apps is that implementation has not been the easiest thing. There have been things you've had to do within Google Tag Manager, things that have to be done outside of it with Google Analytics. There's specific syntax related to our data layer and events and variables, and the documentation has led people astray more than a couple times. So we've definitely taken note of this and aim to fix it with this re-release of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps. So the way that this is handled now, and we'll show an example of this in a moment or two, is the same events, the same event parameters and properties that Fontaine was just going over a few moments ago that show up within Firebase Analytics can be used to trigger tags and configure them with variables and different components of Google Tag Manager, which is a really great way to ensure that you don't have to redo all of your development work. The other thing to note here, we talked a bit about versions, and we looked at that great report that shows the drop off of one version to the next. And I think most of you know, if you've done any sort of app development, it's kind of tough to get a new app version out. And it's really tough to know that your users are actually going to hit that update button. I know that I'm guilty of this, not always updating my apps. You definitely don't want your data to be held hostage by that update process. Because if you realize you need to make a change down the road after you've already shipped your app, you realize that you misnamed an event or you forgot to add a parameter on iOS and it's there on Android and you really want that consistency, you would then have to go back, rebuild your app, put a new app version out there, go through this app update process, cross your fingers and hope that people actually update it. Well, with Google Tag Manager, you don't have to worry about that. You can add Google Tag Manager at the same time that you're adding Firebase Analytics to your apps. And then if you need to make a change, you can do all of that through our easy-to-use web interface. And we'll jump into a demo in a few moments to talk about that.
As an analyst, one of the worst things I used to hear is, oh, that's going to have to wait till the next app version, which is like 3 to 6 months down the road.
Right. And you know, Google Tag Manager has been known to make this very easy on the web, and the same problems exist on mobile apps, and actually they're a lot worse for these reasons. So then the last thing that I'll mention here is tag management capabilities. So these are things like version control, knowing exactly when you've made a change to the instrumentation of your measurement, being able to roll it back if you realize in your data that something has gone wrong and you want to be able to modify it really quickly. I've talked to a lot of developers who've had this problem. But also preview capabilities. So before you get that far, before you realize that you've made a change, being able to preview your implementation, your measurement in your app before it's shipped live to everybody is a really powerful feature. And this is very easy to do with Google Tag Manager. There's a way to access a link that you can open your app from. And then you're seeing the version of your app implementation, all of the measurement for Firebase Analytics, all of the measurement for Google Analytics, and all these other tools that you can implement there, which is a great way to make sure you're not making mistakes. Similarly to some of the things that Fontaine, you had talked about earlier around trying to do a lot with one SDK, making it lightweight and easy to use, we're very excited that we've been able to expand this functionality through Google Tag Manager to some of our partners. So a few examples of these partners: Kochava, Tune, AppsFlyer, Adjust, AppSolar, and more to come. You can implement a lot of their measurement through Google Tag Manager. For some of these vendors, you're able to do so without implementing their SDK. For certain reasons, some of them do request that you implement their SDK alongside our implementation, but either way, you get a lot of those same benefits we just talked about by implementing these tools through Google Tag Manager. There's also an element of consistency here and the ability to trigger things off of these events that Fontaine had talked about and showed us these built-in, these automatically collected events. It's a really great ability to be able to fire off a request, an event to Google Analytics or one of these third parties based on an automatically collected event without doing any development work at all. So let me just show very quickly what this would look like. Now, we did talk about the fact that there are a lot of automatically collected events, but that you can also do things custom, right? You can log your own events if you want to do something that's in our suggested events in our developer documentation, or if you want to custom log some event yourself. Here's an example of how you might do this on Android if you wanted to log an event when somebody shares an image. And you're actually passing here a parameter of the image name. Now, when this is logged, this is the Firebase Analytics code. When this is logged in Firebase Analytics, and Google Tag Manager is also present in the app, you can very easily configure a new variable in Google Tag Manager to pull out that event parameter, that image name. And this means that as soon as that event occurs, this variable is going to be populated with the value that's being passed in as the image name. Similarly, for the event here, we can set up a new trigger that says when a custom event occurs with the event name equaling share image, we can tell Google Tag Manager to do something. Now, this is how we would re-instrument, as an example, Google Analytics within the app based on the Firebase Analytics implementation. So this is a really clean way to take that implementation that your developers, if you're a marketer, had done or yourself had done in your app for Firebase Analytics, and use it as a bridge to translate those events and those parameters and those user properties over to Google Analytics. So with that, let's take a look at the interface and see what this looks like in the product. All right. So one thing to note here is that with this new version of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps, you do need to start with a new container. And the reason for that is we've added a lot of functionality to these containers based on Firebase Analytics that wasn't possible with our previous SDK and with our previous container implementation. So to get started, I'll just create a new container for an iOS app here. And you can see as soon as you select your platform, whether it's iOS or Android, of course, we could also create a container for web, you'll be asked to select the SDK version. So previously, you wouldn't have had to do this. And all of the implementations prior to this new release fall under our legacy iOS SDKs or our legacy Android SDKs. In this case, we'll select Firebase, of course, Firebase iOS. We'll create a new container. Now, we're presented with a dialog here. This link would take us over to our developer documentation and would walk us through the same implementation of the Firebase SDK that's needed for Firebase Analytics. This is a very easy implementation, very lightweight, a couple of lines of code in addition to that SDK. So now what you'll see is when you go to create a new tag, there's a lot more options. Now, previously in Google Tag Manager for mobile apps, there were only a few tag options. They were all Google products. The first thing you'll notice here is Firebase. So if we click into Firebase, what we can do is we can actually modify, add, and block events. Now, I talked about how this could be beneficial for making changes after your app has shipped. You might, as an example, want to modify an event. So this has come up a few times in our development where we've launched a version of an app, maybe the Endless Skater app, with a specific event name. And then after we shipped it, we realized that the event name was slightly different on iOS and Android. And when we tried to export that data and we tried to match it up, it was a real nuisance. So using this, we could simply override that event name. Now, whatever event this is applying to will actually be the event that we're triggering on. So in this case, it would be this share image event. And this would be a share image trigger. So when this occurs, what we could do is, I'll just show an example of what we could do, share new image, right? So now when I save this tag and this container is published, every time that share event occurs within the Firebase Analytics implementation, before the data actually gets over to Firebase Analytics, it would be modified to this new event name, which is a great way to make sure that things are getting into the tool in the right way. So similarly, you could add new events or block them. But one of the really cool things here, as Fontaine highlighted, is the ability to trigger Google Analytics tags based off of this same implementation of Firebase Analytics. So what we could do here, just showing an example of setting up an event. Oops. And this could be something like user interaction, and the action would be share image. Now, I could, if I wanted to, pull in the event name automatically, so I don't have to have this static. This could be a dynamic event that's pulling in all these variables. And then what I would probably do down here is set up a new variable for the event parameter. And in this case, it would be image name. And this is the same image, the same variable that I was just showing in that previous code example. So once we've done this, we just need to tell it when to trigger. And we've already done that with the share image trigger. So if I then create this tag, publish the container, every time a user shares an image in their app and that event is logged for Firebase Analytics, another event will be sent off to Google Analytics to log this same information. So it's a great way to make sure that you're able to do the analysis you need to do in the tool that you want to do it in a unified manner.
And making sure it's that same data set.
Exactly right.
Across both.
Yep, and
apps.
consistent. Now, in the same manner that you can trigger Google Analytics tags here, you can do the same thing with any of the third-party tools that we've integrated. So, I don't need to go through a full example of this, but just to show you, it's configured in a very much similar way, where you're meant to enter in the specific ID associated with that tool. The event name, of course, we could again pull in dynamically here with a variable in Google Tag Manager, so we don't have to do everything manually. So there's a lot of cool things here that we've improved behind the scenes as well. And I don't have time, of course, to go through all of them. But one thing that I will point out really quickly is if you did have multiple application IDs and you wanted to do things a little bit more scalably than having one container for every single app and having to make sure that you're updating every single one of these, you could now create a lookup table. And this is a feature that has previously been limited to web, and we've now extended it to mobile. And in this manner, we could have something like the app version code, and we say, okay, when the app version code is one, make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for this ID. If it's 2, make it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So it's just some of the functionality that's available in the new version of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps. But with that, let's go back to the slides.
Awesome. So thank you guys both so much for those really robust overviews and demos. I think we got a really good idea of what Firebase Analytics is all about and GTM for mobile apps v2. So before we jump into Q&A, and there are a lot of questions that have come in for you guys, I just want to remind you of our resources. So if you take a look at the slides, you'll see we have Firebase Analytics documentation, as well as support. Same thing for GTM. I think it's support.google.com/tagmanager.
That's right.
And then, as always, you can find us on Twitter and social media. It's at Google Analytics. At Firebase has its own Twitter handle. And I'm at Krista Seiden. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into Q&A. Okay, so I have a couple of pretty meaty questions. But But in the interest of time, let's try to make these succinct answers. So Andre wants to know, and I know that you covered this, but let's give a couple of high-level bullet points. When do you go for Firebase instead of a GA implementation through the GTM SDK?
So I think it depends on if you have a website and if you want your data stored and visualized in the same way that GA stores and visualizes data. So as you saw, the Firebase UI is very different than the GA UI. So if you're comfortable and are happy with the GA features and functionality, then perhaps it makes sense to continue to use what you have or use GTM to send your Firebase data over. If you are looking for a more app-specific view of analytics, then that's really where I think Firebase Analytics shines. Also, there's a whole bunch of other features in Firebase that are much easier to take advantage of if you're actually using the Firebase product fully. So if you want to use push notifications, if you want to use crash reporting, etc. Also, Firebase Analytics has strong attribution tracking. So if you're trying to track your AdWords campaigns or campaigns of a host of other networks that we partner with, Firebase is stronger on that front.
The other thing to note here, if you are getting started with a new app, we definitely recommend implementing the Firebase Analytics add-on there, and in addition to that, Google Tag Manager. Google Tag Manager is actually now built as part of the Firebase SDK. It's not a standalone SDK anymore. Now, all of the legacy implementations you have and all of your legacy containers will continue to work. But if you were getting started with a new app, there's absolutely no reason you wouldn't want to use Firebase SDK, use Firebase Analytics, and Google Tag Manager, and as we showed, you can bridge that data over to Google Analytics for all the reasons that Fontaine just talked about.
Awesome. Marius wants to know, what are the main differences between Google Analytics for mobile apps and Firebase Analytics?
So there's a bunch, but I will highlight 3 or 4. First of all, Firebase Analytics is completely free and unlimited. So we heard a lot of app developers, even small app developers, running into hit limits with GA. So when we set out to build Firebase Analytics, we really wanted to build something where developers could get all of their data without any sampling or limits. So free and unlimited was a critical part. We also have the metrics and the language that we're using throughout the product are a lot more app-centric. So you'll notice that there's far few session metrics in Firebase relative to GA, but there's a lot more user-based metrics because we heard from app developers over and over that they were really looking to do user analysis and not so much session analysis. We've got really strong integrations across other Firebase features and Google products. So we talked about the audiences. We've got really strong reporting on push notifications, on dynamic links, which is a Firebase product, et cetera. And then, as I highlighted a minute ago, the attribution features on Firebase are a lot more built with attribution in mind. So we have advertising identifiers are collected automatically. The URL builder is embedded into the product. So it is a lot easier to track your ad campaigns with Firebase Analytics.
Great. Steven wants to know, does Firebase Analytics utilize the same user ID feature as in Google Analytics? This is important for cross-device tracking.
Great question. So when you're hooking up your app with Firebase Analytics, you are able to store user ID in a field. We don't have a dedicated user ID report in Firebase Analytics, but we do have an integration with BigQuery where you can link to BigQuery for free and you can store your data in BigQuery and export it there. When you export your data, user ID will be available. So if you wanted to do a cross-device analysis using your database in BigQuery, that's available because your user ID will be available there.
And because it's in BigQuery and because you can export from Analytics 360 to BigQuery and you can pull them both in with Data Studio, you can do a nice little cross-device analysis via Data Studio.
Exactly.
Josh wants to know, is first attribution being populated dependent on deep linking campaign URLs?
So we've got a couple of different ways to do attribution in Firebase Analytics. So you have first open attribution, which is basically doing install attribution. And then you have attribution for other types of conversions, like your in-app purchases or maybe your sign up or whatever other conversions you care about. So they populate based on slightly different things. Traditionally, deep link campaigns are different than first open campaigns because deep linking implies that a user has an app installed already. So right now they are both supported but populated in different ways. There's also a new type of technology called deferred deep linking, or the product in Firebase is called dynamic linking. In Firebase, you can do first open attribution for your dynamic link campaigns. So for the most part, deep linking and first opens are independent, and you'll see those visualized independently in attribution. The one exception is for the product dynamic links in Firebase, where we have stronger support there.
Cool. A question for you, Scott. Is there a migration guide available for legacy to Firebase GTM?
So there's not a migration guide available. A migration would be fairly easy depending on how many tags and triggers and variables you have set up. The export-import functionality that we have today does not work one-for-one from our legacy containers to our new containers. And that's largely because a lot of the functionality from these legacy containers, like data layer variables and value collection macros and content experiments that were previously part of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps, are no longer part of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps. Some of that functionality has moved to other products. Firebase has a tool called Remote Config that has taken the place of our value collections and content experiments. One thing you can do if you really have a lot of tags and triggers and variables and you want to be able to migrate from one to the other, if you remove all of those data layer variables and value collections and content experiments, the import-export functionality does work. Otherwise, we do recommend just to start setting things up. You want to make sure in this process you're not overlooking anything, and that's one of the reasons we didn't want to just drop data layer variables and things as we were migrating or importing across these different container contexts. So it's beneficial to start thinking about this as a fresh start to this implementation.
Great. Stephen wants to know, does Firebase Analytics work with third-party SDKs? Example, Tag Container SDK is installed and sends data to GA. Does Firebase allow that? You take that one.
No, Firebase Analytics needs to be implemented with the Firebase SDK. In this particular example, I think if you had the legacy Google Tag Manager SDK as an example, there's not a way to implement Firebase Analytics in that old SDK. To do so, you would need to get started with the Firebase SDK and implement the add-on for Firebase Analytics.
Evan wants to know, how does Firebase handle offline tracking and dispatching?
When the app comes back online, the Firebase SDK will attempt to send it back to our backend. So yes, we do have support there.
So everything's tracked offline. Once you're back online, we send a batch.
Right, we're storing it on the client until it reconnects.
Great. Charles wants to know, does Firebase allow for filters? Example, force data to lowercase. So not filters using an audience to filter down a report, filters as in GA.
Yeah, so GA has this notion of accounts, properties, and views, where views or profiles are basically different views of the property data. With Firebase, we have more of a one-to-one notion where there is no longer a property and a view. We just have one notion of an app. So no, there isn't different views of data on top of your app. You just have one canonical view. However, for that specific question around forcing data to lowercase, that feels like a great application of Google Tag Manager, where you can make sure that all of the events that are being sent up are in fact lowercase.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of this can be done today with the modify event tag that we were showing. Now, you would, as I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, today need to know what those events are and make sure that you're lowercasing them. But the good news is that we're working on a lot of new custom tech functionality within Google Tag Manager for mobile apps that would allow you to actually do this dynamically without knowing every single event that you needed to lowercase.
Okay, so kind of to sum both of your points up, it sounds like in Firebase Analytics, whatever you're sending is what's captured and shown in the analytics interface there, but whatever you're then sending to GA, either via GTM or just through your GA filters, you can filter and modify whatever way that you would like that data to show up in the GA interface.
And also in Firebase. So if you were sending data to Firebase Analytics and you had Google Tag Manager implemented, you could modify your Firebase Analytics events before they get to Firebase.
Okay.
So you're just modifying it at the client side there.
Okay. So then I guess the answer is the filters aren't built into Firebase. You do it through GTM.
Exactly.
Okay, great. How about enhanced e-commerce?
So enhanced e-commerce is not yet supported in Firebase Analytics, though it's something that we've definitely heard from some users that they'd be interested in. So we'll continue to keep it on our radar as we flesh out Firebase Analytics more.
Great. Charles would like to know, will Google Analytics still be supporting and making updates to the Google Analytics mobile SDK?
Great question. So we will it's unlikely that we would be adding new features and functionality to the Google Analytics SDK, though we will certainly continue to support it and it will continue to be around for a while. But we really believe that Firebase Analytics, which is built specifically for app developers, is a stronger product for app developers. So the Google Analytics SDK won't be getting any new features, but will certainly continue to be supported.
Great. Jim would like to know, can GTM v2 only be used with Firebase?
Yes. So it's built in as a dependency with the Firebase SDK. There's not a separate SDK to implement.
For Firebase, but GTM v2 is also like GTM for mobile apps is the new version. You don't necessarily have to be using Firebase, or you do?
You do.
Okay.
So you have to, in order to get started with this new version of Google Tag Manager for mobile apps, you implement the Firebase SDK, the Firebase Analytics portion of it, and then the Google Tag Manager portion of it. It's not a standalone SDK anymore. And in this manner, you're able to use all of that same syntax for that implementation, and there's not a separate data layer syntax or anything like that. It uses all of the Firebase Analytics logic.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially considering what you guys showed us. They really do work better together.
Mm-hmm.
So a question from Amsel. Currently, it appears that the Firebase Analytics to GA integration is only available on new GA properties. This has obvious drawbacks. Will there be support to import this data into existing properties?
So good question. Right now, the way that the linking works between Google Analytics and Firebase Analytics, it's creating a new property at the time of linking. So that will continue to be that way. However, if you want to use the integration with Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics, you can certainly send that data to the property that you've been using historically. So depending on which path you want to take, if you want them to all live in the same property, then Google Tag Manager could be a path to do that. But if you're just using the linking piece, then we are creating a new property for you.
Great. So that about wraps up all of the questions that we had. In our last minute or two here, do you have any last thoughts that you would like to share with people, or what are you most excited about with these new releases?
Yeah, I think we've made a lot of progress and put forth a pretty strong product, but we're also really excited on continuing to shape it with the feedback of our customers. So we welcome your feedback and want to hear what you like about it and what areas we should improve.
Yeah. In the same vein, we were very much looking forward to a lot of developers and marketers starting to use Google Tag Manager for mobile apps, this new version of it, alongside Firebase. And one sort of tip that I would throw out there is if you're starting to think about Firebase Analytics, think about Google Tag Manager for mobile apps as well. A lot of the benefits we talked about around being able to make updates after the app has shipped are not actually there if you don't implement Google Tag Manager before the app has shipped. So just something to think about. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. I think this is a really informative session for our users. And we will see you guys back in a few weeks for our next Hangout. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Krista.
Thank you.